In a small-town gymnasium decorated with patriotic banners, a trembling woman in a navy cardigan was about to face her greatest fear. What started as a quiet attempt to remain invisible at a veterans ceremony took a life-or-death turn when a decorated Navy SEAL commander collapsed on stage, his heart failing in front of 200 helpless witnesses. Naomi Ellis wasn't your typical ceremony attendee. For 6 years, she had spent her life as a Navy corpsman on deployments across war zones, known for her steady hands and unwavering commitment to saving lives. But that was before Petty Officer Marcus Hayes died under those same hands, before survivor's guilt drove her into hiding, before she convinced herself she was too broken to ever help anyone again. When Commander Jack Rourke's heart stopped beating mid-speech, she had no idea she was about to confront the trauma that had paralyzed her for 6 months. With only 3 minutes before irreversible brain damage would set in, Naomi had to make an impossible choice: remain invisible in the safety of the back row, or step onto that stage and risk failing again in front of everyone. What began as a paralyzing flashback to Afghanistan would become a 3-minute battle against death itself, fought with nothing but her bare hands and the training she thought she'd left behind. The Riverside Community Center gymnasium squeaked against the polished floor as people settled into their seats, the sound echoing off the center block walls like a nervous heartbeat. Naomi Ellis sat in the very back row, her spine pressed against the cold metal of the chair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She'd chosen this seat deliberately, the furthest from the stage, the closest to the exit, tucked behind a pillar that cast just enough shadow to make her feel invisible. That was the goal, after all, to be here because she'd been invited, because it would have been rude not to come, but to not really be seen. Above her head, red, white, and blue banners hung from the rafters, hand-painted with careful letters that read, "Veterans Appreciation Day," and "Thank you for your service." The gym smelled like floor wax and coffee from the refreshment table by the door, mixed with something else, something she couldn't quite name but recognized in her bones. The scent of duty, maybe, of sacrifice, of stories that people wore on their faces instead of their sleeves. Naomi tugged at the hem of her navy blue cardigan, suddenly conscious of how plain she looked. No uniform today. She'd left the Navy 6 months ago, and the dress blues were packed away in a box under her bed, folded with hospital corners she'd learned in boot camp. She'd thought about wearing them today, had even laid them out on her bed this morning, but the sight of that crisp white and gold had made her stomach twist. Who was she to wear that uniform here, among these people? Real veterans, real heroes, not someone like her. At the front of the gymnasium, a makeshift stage had been erected, draped with more patriotic bunting and flanked by the American flag and the POW MIA banner. A podium stood center stage, and behind it, a row of chairs for the guests of honor. She counted 7 chairs. 7 veterans who'd be recognized today for their service, their sacrifice, their courage. She knew she wasn't one of them. She checked the program 3 times, relief and shame warring in her chest each time she confirmed her name wasn't listed. The crowd was filling in now. Maybe 200 people in a gym meant to hold 300. Veterans of all ages, their faces telling stories their mouths might never speak. A man in his 90s with a walker, wearing a cap that said "Korea Veteran" in gold embroidery. A woman in her 50s with a prosthetic leg visible beneath her dress plants, laughing with friends. Families, too. Children squirming in their Sunday best, teenagers slouched in rebellion, spouses with that particular look Naomi had learned to recognize. The look that said they'd learned to love someone who carried invisible wounds. Naomi's eyes drifted to the stage again, and she felt that familiar tightening in her chest. That voice that lived in the back of her mind, the one that never quite shut up, started its familiar litany. You don't belong here. You were just a medic. You never saw combat, not really. You were on ships and hospitals, patching up cuts and handing out ibuprofen. You're not like them. You're not brave. She closed her eyes, breathing through her nose the way the VA therapist had taught her. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. It didn't help much. The tightness remained, coiled around her ribs like barbed wire. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed from the speakers, and Naomi's eyes snapped open. Colonel Thomas Avery stood at the podium, a man in his early 70s with the kind of posture that screamed military even in civilian clothes. His suit was pressed to knife edges, his silver hair cut high and tight, his jaw set with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years being obeyed. Naomi found herself sitting straighter despite herself, muscle memory kicking in. "We gather here today," Avery continued, his voice carrying weight even through the crackling sound system, "to honor those among us who answered the call, who raised their right hand and swore an oath to defend this nation, knowing full well the cost that oath might demand." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today, we recognize not just service, but sacrifice, not just duty, but courage, not just veterans, but heroes." Naomi felt something twist in her stomach. Heroes. The word felt too big, too bright, too far removed from anything she'd ever done. She thought about her deployments. The USS Mercy off the coast of Indonesia after the tsunami. The field hospital in Kandahar, where she'd spent 6 months treating everything from heat exhaustion to shrapnel wounds. The quiet, tedious, necessary work of keeping people alive. Nothing heroic about it. Just her job. "Our first guest of honor today," Avery said, gesturing to the chairs behind him, "is a man who needs no introduction to anyone who's followed the Navy SEALs over the past 2 decades. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turning. Commander Jack Rourke, 28 years of service, 7 combat deployments, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, a leader, a warrior, and a brother to all who've served." The applause started before Avery finished speaking, building like a wave. Naomi watched as a man rose from the front row and climbed the steps to the stage. Commander Jack Rourke moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life in peak physical condition, his shoulders broad beneath his dress uniform, his face weathered but strong. He had to be in his late 40s, maybe 50, but he carried himself like a man half that age. The rows of ribbons on his chest caught the gymnasium lights, a rainbow of valor that made Naomi's stomach clench with something she couldn't quite name. Awe, maybe. Or envy. Or just the acute awareness of her own inadequacy. Rourke shook Avery's hand, the grip firm and brief, and took his place in the first chair. His eyes scanned the crowd briefly, and for a moment, just a moment, Naomi thought his gaze lingered on her back row. But that was impossible. He couldn't see her back here. No one could. That was the whole point. The ceremony continued. More names, more stories, more applause. A Marine who'd served in Fallujah, an Army specialist who'd been a POW in Iraq, an Air Force pilot who'd flown supply missions in Afghanistan. Each one stood, each one received their recognition, and each one made Naomi feel smaller, more invisible, more certain that she'd made the right choice sitting in the back. Between the recognitions, Naomi's mind wandered. She thought about the letter she'd received last month, forwarded from her old command, an invitation to this ceremony, handwritten on official letterhead from Colonel Avery himself. "We would be honored if you would join us to celebrate all who have served," it had said. She'd almost thrown it away, almost convinced herself she had errands to run, appointments to keep, any excuse not to come, but some stubborn thread of obligation or maybe just loneliness had made her say yes. Now she regretted it. This wasn't for her. These people, these heroes with their medals and their scars and their stories of valor under fire, they'd earned their place here. She'd just been doing her job, keeping her head down, following orders, trying not to think about the blood on her hands or the faces of the ones she couldn't save. Especially that one face, the one that still visited her dreams, uninvited and unwelcome. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Hayes, 23 years old, shrapnel wound to the femoral artery. She'd had 7 minutes with him before the medevac arrived. She'd done everything right. Every step of the protocol, every compression, every word of encouragement. But 7 minutes hadn't been enough. She'd watched the light leave his eyes, felt his pulse fade under her fingers, heard his last words, "Tell my mom I was brave," and then nothing. The investigation had cleared her of any wrongdoing. The wound was too severe, the blood loss too rapid, the circumstances beyond her control. But clearance didn't equal forgiveness, not from herself. She'd replayed those 7 minutes 1,000 times, searching for the mistake she must have made, the thing she should have done differently, the reason he died under her hands. Naomi blinked hard, forcing the memory back into its box. Not here, not now. She focused on the stage again, where Colonel Avery was introducing the final honoree of the afternoon. She'd missed most of the speech, caught in the undertow of her own thoughts, but she tuned back in to hear him say, "And now, Commander Rourke has graciously agreed to say a few words about service and sacrifice." The applause applauded again as Rourke stood and approached the podium. He moved with confidence but not arrogance, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression serious but warm. He watched him adjust the microphone, clear his throat, and begin to speak. "Thank you, Colonel Avery," Rourke said, his voice deep and steady. "Thank you all for being here today. I'm honored, truly honored to stand before you." He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd again. "But I have to be honest, when they asked me to speak today, I struggled with what to say, because the truth is, I'm not comfortable with the word hero." A surprised murmur rippled through the audience. Naomi felt her attention sharpen despite herself. "Don't get me wrong," Rourke continued, a slight smile touching his lips. "I'm proud of my service, proud of my teams, proud of what we accomplished. But heroism, that's not about the medals on your chest or the ribbons on your uniform. That's not about the firefights or the missions or the number of deployments you've done." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something more intimate despite the microphone. "Heroism is about showing up when it matters, about doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified, especially when you're terrified." Naomi's hands clenched tighter in her lap. "I've served with some incredible warriors over the years. SEALs, Marines, Army Rangers. But you know who I think about most? The medics, the corpsmen, the ones who ran toward the gunfire not to fight, but to save. The ones who held pressure on wounds while rounds snapped overhead. The ones who whispered comfort to dying men and then stood up and saved the next one." His voice grew stronger. "Those are the heroes who don't get enough recognition, the quiet ones, the ones who think they're just doing their job." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. It felt like he was speaking directly to her, though he knew that was impossible. He didn't know she existed. This was just a speech, just words, just... "So today," he said, "I want to..." And then he stopped. The change happened so fast that Naomi's brain took a moment to process it. 1 second, Commander Jack Rourke was standing at the podium, mid-sentence, his hand raised in emphasis. The next second, that hand dropped to his chest, clutching at his uniform as his face went pale beneath his tan. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a gasp, sharp and surprised, caught by the microphone and amplified across the silent gymnasium.
"Commander?" Colonel Avery stepped forward, his voice uncertain in a way that sent ice through Naomi's veins. Rourke swayed, his knees buckled, and then he fell. Not a graceful collapse, not a controlled descent. He simply dropped, his body hitting the stage with a sound that made the entire audience gasp as one. His head struck the wooden platform with a crack that carried even without the microphone. His legs twitched once, twice, and then went still. For a heartbeat, maybe two, nobody moved. The gymnasium seemed frozen in a tableau of shock, 200 people processing what they'd just witnessed. Then, chaos erupted. "Jack!" A woman's scream tore through the silence, raw and terrified. From the front row, a woman in her late 40s lunged toward the stage, her heels catching on the hem of her dress as she scrambled up the steps. Linda Rourke, Naomi's mind supplied automatically, though she didn't know how she knew. The commander's wife. Jack! Oh God, Jack! Colonel Avery was already kneeling beside Rourke, his hands hovering uncertainly over the fallen man's body, as if afraid to touch him. Other veterans rushed the stage, their chairs clattering behind them. Voices overlapped, urgent and confused. Someone call 911. Give him space. Is he breathing? What happened? He's having a heart attack. Jack, please, Jack! Linda Rourke reached her husband and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically patting his face, his chest, her own face crumbling with terror. Jack, can you hear me? Someone help him! Please, someone help! The crowd was on its feet now, pressing forward in a surge of horrified concern that made the orderly ceremony dissolve into pandemonium. People shouted over each other, children cried, phones appeared as people called for help or filmed the catastrophe unfolding before them. The veterans on stage tried to create space around Rourke's body, but their efforts were drowned in the tide of panic. Everyone, step back! Avery's command voice cut through the noise, decades of authority packed into those 3 words. Clear the stage, now! Some people obeyed, backing away with stunned faces. Others pushed closer, unable to help but unable to look away. Naomi watched it all from her chair in the back row, her body frozen, her mind racing. He's down. Cardiac event. Probable myocardial infarction. Check ABCs. Airway, breathing, circulation. Time is tissue. Every second counts. The medical training activated in her brain like a switch being flipped, automatic and clinical. But her body wouldn't move. Her legs felt welded to the floor, her arms locked at her sides. She stared at the stage, at the chaos, at Rourke's too still form and Linda's desperate hands trying to shake him awake, and something inside her screamed, "Move! You're a medic! Move!" But she couldn't. Because moving meant being seen, meant stepping into that spotlight, that circle of panic and pressure and expectation, meant putting her hands on someone's life again and risking that she'd fail? That she'd do everything right and it wouldn't be enough. That she'd watch another face go slack, another chest stop rising, another voice fade into silence. "Is there a doctor?" Avery bellowed, his eyes scanning the crowd desperately. "We need a doctor. Is anyone here a doctor?" Silence. Or not silence exactly, but the absence of an answer. Just the babble of frightened voices, the sound of Linda Rourke sobbing, the distant wail of a siren that might have been real or might have been Naomi's imagination supplying what she knew should come next. "A nurse, paramedic, anyone with medical training." Avery's voice cracked slightly, the authority slipping to reveal the fear beneath. He was a soldier, had commanded men in combat, but this was different. This was a brother falling not in battle, but in safety, in celebration, and he had no idea how to save him. Naomi's throat constricted. Her hands trembled. "Do something. Say something. Stand up." But the words wouldn't come. The movement wouldn't come. She was frozen, locked in place by fear so profound it felt like drowning. On stage, Linda Rourke's sobs grew louder, more desperate. "Please, someone, please! He's not breathing! Jack, please don't leave me, please!" Not breathing. The words cut through Naomi's paralysis like a blade. Not breathing meant minutes, maybe 3, maybe 4 before brain damage set in. Not breathing meant CPR, meant rescue breathing, meant decisive action taken immediately or a life lost forever. She knew this, had been trained on it, had practiced on dummies and then on real bodies, real wounds, real crises. She knew exactly what to do.
And she still couldn't move. The gymnasium swam in Naomi's vision, the bright overhead lights suddenly too harsh, the press of bodies too close, even though she sat alone in the back row. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing in her ears like artillery fire. On the stage, Commander Rourke's body lay motionless, and Naomi could see from even this distance that his chest wasn't rising, not breathing. The clinical part of her brain repeated it like a mantra. Not breathing equals no oxygen equals cellular death in 3 to 5 minutes equals brain damage equals... Stop. Breathe. Think. But thinking was the problem, because when she thought, when she let her mind spin back, she wasn't in this gymnasium anymore. She was in a field hospital in Kandahar, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the smell of copper and antiseptic thick in her throat. She was 26 years old and she had her hands pressed against Marcus Hayes's thigh, trying to hold back the tide of blood that pulsed between her fingers with each weakening beat of his heart. "Stay with me, Marcus," she'd said then, her voice steady even though her hands shook. "Medevac is 2 minutes out. 2 minutes. You can do this." But he couldn't. She'd watched his eyes go distant, watched him try to speak, watched his lips form words she couldn't quite hear over the noise of the trauma bay. She'd leaned closer, her ear to his mouth, and heard him whisper, "Tell my mom I was brave." And then nothing. She'd continued compressions anyway, continued the protocol even as the monitor flatlined, continued until the doctor pulled her away and said the words she'd known were coming. "Time of death." "We need help!" Colonel Avery's voice crashed back into the present, dragging Naomi out of the memory with the violence of a physical blow. "For God's sake, is anyone here a medic?" I am. But the words stayed locked in her throat, trapped behind the wall of fear and doubt and the crushing weight of Marcus Hayes's death. Because what if she tried and failed again? What if she stepped onto that stage, put her hands on Commander Rourke's chest, did everything right, and watched him die anyway? What if Linda Rourke looked at her with the same desperate hope Marcus's mother had shown when Naomi came to her door, before hope curdled into grief? On stage, Linda's hands were on his husband's face now, smoothing his hair back, her voice breaking into pieces. "Jack, baby, please, please don't do this, not now, not like this." She looked up, her eyes wild, scanning the crowd. "Somebody help him! Why isn't anyone helping him?" Why isn't anyone helping him? The question hung in the air, an accusation and a plea rolled into one. Naomi's eyes swept the crowd, searching for someone else, anyone else who might step forward. Surely there was someone, a nurse, an EMT, someone more qualified, someone braver, someone who wouldn't freeze at the critical moment. Her gaze landed on faces in the crowd, and she saw the same helplessness reflected back at her. Veterans who'd faced enemy fire without flinching now stood paralyzed by a different kind of crisis. Families who'd endured deployments and uncertainty now rendered useless by medical emergency. Everyone waiting for someone else to act. No one was moving. No one knew what to do. "CPR!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Someone start CPR!" But still, no one moved toward the stage. Avery looked up from Rourke's body, his face stricken. "I don't know how," he admitted, the words torn from him. "I've never been trained." "You have," the voice in her head whispered. "You've been trained. You know how. You could save him. Or you could kill him, just like Marcus." No, that wasn't fair. Marcus's death wasn't her fault. The doctors had said so. The investigation had cleared her. The wound was unsurvivable, the blood loss too catastrophic. There was nothing more she could have done. She knew that intellectually, had heard it repeated by her therapist, her command, her fellow corpsman. But knowing something intellectually and believing it in your bones were two very different things. Naomi's hands gripped the sides of her chair, knuckles white with tension. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps now, the panic attack building like a wave about to crash over her head.
The rational part of her brain knew what was happening. Sympathetic nervous system activation, fight or flight response, trauma trigger. She should do the breathing exercises, ground herself in the present, remind herself that this was not Kandahar and Rourke was not Marcus, and she had the skills and knowledge to help. But the irrational part, the part that lived in her nightmares and whispered in her darkest moments, that part said, if you try and fail, it will destroy you. If you watch another person die under your hands, you'll never recover. Better to stay silent, better to stay safe, better to... Linda Rourke's eyes found hers.
Naomi didn't know how it happened. The gymnasium was packed with people, 200 faces, and she was hidden in the back, behind a pillar in the shadows. But somehow, across all that distance, Linda's gaze locked onto hers with laser precision. Maybe it was chance. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe Linda was just looking at everyone and anyone, searching for help in every face she could see. But in that moment, it felt like Linda was looking directly into Naomi's soul. And what Naomi saw in Linda's eyes broke something inside her. Not anger, not accusation, not even hope. Just raw, animal terror. The look of someone watching their world end in real time, powerless to stop it. The look that said, this is the man I love, the father of my children, the center of my universe. And he's dying in front of me, and I can't help him, and nobody else will either. In that look, Naomi saw every military spouse who'd ever gotten the knock on the door, every parent who'd received the folded flag, every person who'd loved someone in uniform and lived with the knowledge that any goodbye might be the last one. Linda Rourke had survived 28 years of deployments, of her husband going into harm's way again and again and coming home scarred but alive. And now, here, in a safe gymnasium in a small American town, during a ceremony meant to honor his survival, he was dying anyway. The unfairness of it cut through Naomi's paralysis like a scalpel. 3 minutes. Commander Rourke had been down for perhaps 45 seconds now, maybe a minute. That left 2, maybe 3 minutes before irreversible brain damage set in. 2 or 3 minutes to act, to intervene, to do something. Marcus Hayes flashed through her mind again, but this time the memory came with different words. Not, tell my mom I was brave, but something her instructor had said in medic training years ago. You won't save everyone. Some wounds are too severe, some situations too dire. But that doesn't mean you stop trying, because the ones you can save, they're worth every failure along the way. Naomi's hands released their death grip on the chair. Her legs trembled as she stood, her knees weak and her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst through her ribs. The gymnasium seemed to tilt around her, vertigo and adrenaline and fear mixing into a cocktail that made her stomach heave. She could still sit back down, could still retreat into invisibility, could still protect herself from the possibility of failure. Or she could walk forward. The distance from her chair to the stage couldn't have been more than 60 feet. But as Naomi forced one foot in front of the other, it felt like miles. Every step was a battle against the voice screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to hide. People's eyes tracked her movement, confusion rippling through the crowd as this unknown woman in the back row suddenly pushed through the mass of bodies. Naomi kept her eyes fixed on the stage, on Linda's desperate face, on Rourke's too still form. One foot, then another, then another. Her hands were shaking so violently she shoved them in her cardigan pockets to hide it. Her throat was dry as sand. Her vision tunneled until all she could see was the stage ahead, the man dying on it, the wife begging for someone to save him.
Someone bumped into her, and Naomi almost stopped, almost turned and fled. But then she thought of Marcus Hayes one more time. Thought of how she'd promised herself, in the aftermath of his death, that she'd never let fear stop her from trying again. She'd broken that promise every day since leaving the Navy, letting her trauma and guilt keep her small, keep her hidden, keep her safe. But safe wasn't brave. And brave was what this moment demanded. Naomi reached the front of the crowd, her legs carrying her forward on autopilot now. The steps to the stage loomed before her, 5 wooden risers that might as well have been a mountain. She looked up at Colonel Avery, at Linda Rourke, at the small cluster of veterans standing helplessly around the fallen commander. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in 6 months, Naomi Ellis spoke with the voice of a Navy corpsman. "I'm a medic." The words came out rough, barely above a whisper, but they came out. "Let me through." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then Colonel Avery's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with something between relief and desperation. "You're a medic?" "Navy corpsman," Naomi said, her voice stronger now as she climbed the steps. Her legs still trembled, but forward momentum carried her up and across the stage. 6 years, multiple deployments, I'm trained." "Thank God." Avery stepped back immediately, his military instincts recognizing authority when he heard it, even wrapped in a trembling voice and a cardigan. "Clear the stage. Everyone back now." His command cut through the chaos like a blade. The cluster of veterans surrounding Rourke's body parted, creating space. Linda Rourke looked up at Naomi, her face streaked with tears, her hands still clutching her husband's uniform. "Can you save him? Please, can you save him?" Naomi dropped to her knees beside Rourke, her training taking over even as her heart threatened to hammer out of her chest. She couldn't promise anything, couldn't guarantee
outcomes, but she could try. "I'm going to do everything I can," she said, meeting Linda's eyes for just a moment. "But I need you to give me space to work. Can you do that?" Linda nodded frantically, scooting backward but keeping her hands wrapped around her husband's fingers, as if her touch alone could tether him to life. Naomi's hands moved to Rourke's neck, fingers pressing against his carotid artery. The world narrowed to that point of contact, to the desperate search for the flutter of pulse beneath her fingertips. 1 second. 2. 3. There. Faint, irregular, barely present, but there. Not dead yet. Not yet. "He has a pulse," Naomi announced, her voice cutting across the silent gymnasium. "But it's weak and erratic." She tilted his head back, checking his airway, then leaned close to watch his chest. No rise. No fall. No breath. "He's not breathing. Someone call 911 if you haven't already. Tell them we have a male, approximately 50 years old, suspected cardiac arrest, CPR in progress." "Already called," someone shouted from the crowd. "They said 8 minutes." 8 minutes. Naomi's stomach dropped. 8 minutes might as well be 8 hours. The brain could survive 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen before damage set in. 8 minutes meant she had to keep him alive with her hands alone, had to be his heart and his lungs until the professionals arrived with their equipment and their drugs and their definitive care. No pressure. Naomi positioned herself beside Rourke's chest, lacing her fingers together, locking her elbows. The heel of her hand found the center of his sternum, exactly where it needed to be. Muscle memory from hundreds of training sessions, from real emergencies on ship decks and in field hospitals, guided her movements. She looked up at Colonel Avery, who stood watching with an expression of fierce concentration. "I need you to help me," she said. "When I tell you, I need you to deliver rescue breaths. Can you do that?" Avery nodded sharply. "Tell me what to do." 30 compressions, then tilt his head back, pinch his nose, and give 2 breaths. Watch for his chest to rise. Repeat until I say stop or until help arrives. Understood. Naomi took a breath, and then she began. The first compression sent a jolt through Naomi's arms, the resistance of Rourke's sternum solid beneath her palms. She pushed down, hard and fast, 2 inches deep, using her body weight to drive the compression home. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm came automatically, burned into her muscle memory from countless drills she'd once resented. Funny how the things you complain about in training become the things that save lives in crisis. 4, 5, 6. She counted in her head, each number an anchor point in the chaos. Around her, the gymnasium had gone completely silent, 200 people holding their collective breath, watching this unknown woman fight for a decorated commander's life on a stage meant for celebration. 10, 11, 12. Sweat already beaded on her forehead, despite the cool air. Effective CPR was brutal work, physically demanding in ways people never understood until they had to do it for real. Her shoulders burned, her back ached, but she kept going. 15, 16, 17. Don't think about Marcus. Don't think about blood on the floor and a flat line on the monitor. This is different. You can do this. But the doubt crept in anyway, insidious and familiar. What if his ribs crack? What if you're going too deep, not deep enough, too fast, too slow? What if 8 minutes is too long? What if he's already gone and you're just going through the motions, performing CPR on a corpse while his wife watches and hopes? 22, 23, 24. Naomi's vision blurred with effort and tears she refused to let fall. Not now. Not when someone's life depended on her keeping it together. She could fall apart later, in her car, in her apartment, in the shower, where no one could see. But not here, not now. 28, 29, 30. Breaths, she gasped, pulling back. Her arms trembled as Avery moved in, tilting Rourke's head back with surprising gentleness for such a commanding man. He pinched Rourke's nose, sealed his mouth over the commander's, and blew. Once. Twice. Rourke's chest rose and fell with the artificial breaths, a grotesque mimicry of life. Then Naomi was back at it, hands on his chest, compressions starting again. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm became meditative, each push a prayer, each count a desperate bargain with whatever force controlled life and death. Let him live. Please let him live. I can't lose another one. From the corner of her eye, she saw Linda Rourke watching, her face pale, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. Veterans in the crowd stood frozen, some with hands over their mouths, others with tears streaming down weathered faces. They understood, in a way civilians couldn't, what was happening here. The thin line between life and death. The arbitrary nature of survival. The cruel irony of making it through decades of combat, only to fall in a moment of peace.
15, 16, 17. Naomi's cardigan clung to her back with sweat. Her hair fell in her eyes. She didn't care. Nothing mattered except the compression beneath her palms, the steady rhythm that kept blood flowing to Rourke's brain, kept oxygen circulating through his body, kept him hovering in that twilight space between alive and dead. What if I fail? The thought blazed through her mind unbidden. What if I fail and everyone sees? What if they blame me? What if I blame me? 28, 29, 30. Breaths, she said again, and Avery moved in once more. We need an AED, Naomi said as she resumed compressions, her voice tight with strain. An automated external defibrillator. Does this facility have one? Colonel Avery looked up from where he was preparing to deliver another round of breaths, his face stricken. I don't know. I didn't organize the facility. Someone find out, Naomi commanded, her voice cutting through the gymnasium with an authority she didn't know she possessed. Now! Check the walls, the office, anywhere. Red case with a lightning bolt symbol. Move! The crowd erupted into action, people scattering in different directions, searching. Naomi continued compressions, her arms screaming in protest, but her rhythm never faltering. 10, 11, 12. She could feel Rourke's ribs flexing beneath her palms with each push, could feel the awful intimacy of holding someone's life in her hands. "How long has it been?" she gasped between compressions. "Maybe 90 seconds? 2 minutes at most." 6 minutes left. 6 minutes until the ambulance. 6 minutes to keep him viable, keep his brain oxygenated, keep hope alive. 28, 29, 30. Breaths. Repeat. Linda Rourke moved closer, unable to stay back any longer. Her hand found Naomi's arm between compression cycles, gripping tight, desperate. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't stop. He has grandchildren. They're supposed to visit next week. He was going to teach his grandson to fish. Please." The words hit Naomi like shrapnel. Not just a commander, not just a decorated SEAL, but a grandfather. A man with fishing plans and family visits and a future that extended beyond this moment. Marcus Hayes had been someone's son, had a mother who waited for him to come home, and Naomi had failed him. But she wasn't failing Jack Rourke. Not today. Not while she still had strength in her arms. "I'm not stopping," Naomi said, meeting Linda's eyes. Her voice came out fierce, almost angry. "I'm not stopping until the paramedics get here or until he's breathing on his own. You hear me? I'm not giving up on him." Linda's sob was half relief, half terror. She nodded, squeezing Naomi's arm once more before pulling back. 1, 2, 3. The compressions continued. Naomi fell into the rhythm like a trance, her world reduced to the push and release, the count and the breath. Around her, people searched frantically for the AED, calling out negative reports. Not in the office, not in the storage closet, not mounted by the bathrooms. 15, 16, 17. Where is it? Naomi's mind raced as even her body worked. Every facility was supposed to have one, especially public spaces, especially places where crowds gathered. But supposed to and actually having were different things. "Found it!" A voice rang out from the far side of the gymnasium, triumphant and terrified at once. "I found it! By the emergency exit!" "Bring it here," Naomi ordered. "Fast!" 28, 29, 30. Breaths. A man rushed onto the stage, an older veteran with shaking hands, carrying a red case marked with the universal AED symbol. He nearly dropped it in his haste, caught it, set it down beside Naomi with a thud. "I don't know how to use it," he admitted, his voice ashamed. "That's okay," Naomi said, already reaching for the case, even as she resumed compressions one-handed for a brief moment. Naomi ripped open the AED case with hands that had stopped shaking. Fear had burned away in the crucible of action, replaced by crystalline focus. She'd used these devices before, had trained on them, had deployed them in emergencies. The pads came out, adhesive backing peeling away as she positioned them on Rourke's bare chest. Someone had torn his dress uniform open during the initial panic, buttons scattered across the stage, revealing the skin that needed to be bare for the shock to work. "Everyone clear," she said, her voice loud and authoritative. She pressed the power button, and the device chirped to life, its mechanical voice eerily calm in the chaos. "Analyzing rhythm. Do not touch the patient." Naomi pulled back, her hands hovering over Rourke's chest, every muscle coiled to resume compressions the instant she could. The AED hummed, reading the electrical activity of his heart, determining if a shock was warranted. These seconds felt longer than all the compressions combined, stretched and distorted by hope and dread.
"Please, please let it be shockable. Please let there be something to work with." "Shock advised. the device announced, and Naomi's heart leaped. "Clear," she shouted, looking around to make sure no one was touching Rourke. Linda had pulled back, her hands pressed to her mouth. Avery stood a few feet away, his face grim. The crowd watched in breathless silence. Naomi hit the shock button. Rourke's body convulsed, his back arching off the stage as electricity coursed through his heart, attempting to reset its rhythm. The jolt looked violent, inhuman, and Linda's strangled cry echoed through the gym. Then Rourke collapsed back down, motionless. Naomi's hands went immediately back to his chest. No time to wait, no time to see if it worked. The protocol was clear. Shock, then immediately resume compressions for 2 minutes while the heart reorganized itself. Her arms burned with fatigue, but she pushed through it. 1, 2, 3. "Come on, Commander," she muttered under her breath. "Come on. You survived decades in combat. You don't get to die in a gymnasium. Not today." 10, 11, 12. She could feel the difference now, something she couldn't have articulated. The resistance beneath her hands felt different, more responsive somehow. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. Maybe she was imagining signs of life because the alternative was unbearable. 20, 21, 22. The siren she'd heard earlier was louder now, definitely real, definitely close. The ambulance would be here soon. Just had to keep going. Just had to maintain circulation until the professionals arrived with their advanced equipment and their drugs that could actually restart a heart properly. 28, 29, 30. Breaths from Avery. "Check for a pulse," Naomi said, positioning her fingers on Rourke's neck again. "Please, please." There. Not faint this time. Not irregular. Steady. Weak but steady. Her eyes widened. "I have a pulse. It's there." And then, like a miracle, Jack Rourke gasped. It wasn't a smooth breath, wasn't peaceful or gentle. It was ragged and desperate, the sound of a drowning man breaking the surface. But it was a breath. His chest rose on its own, fell, rose again. His eyelids fluttered. "Jack!" Linda Rourke lunged forward, and this time Naomi didn't stop her. "Oh God, Jack!" The gymnasium erupted. Cheers and sobs and applause crashed over Naomi as she sat back on her heels, her whole body shaking now that the crisis had passed. Rourke was breathing. His pulse was there. He was alive. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Naomi looked down at her hands, still trembling, and felt something crack open inside her. Not the fear she'd carried for 6 months, not the guilt that had kept her small and hidden and afraid. Something else. Something that felt suspiciously like hope. The paramedics burst through the gymnasium doors like a cavalry charge, their presence announced by the clatter of equipment and the squeak of wheels on polished floor. 2 of them, a man and a woman, both moving with the practiced efficiency that came from running these calls 100 times before, but they stopped short when they reached the stage, taking in the scene before them. Commander Jack Rourke breathing on his own now, his eyes half open and confused. Linda Rourke clutching his hand, tears streaming down her face. Colonel Avery standing guard like a sentinel, and Naomi Ellis kneeling beside the commander, her cardigan soaked with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead, her hands still positioned near Rourke's chest as if she couldn't quite believe she could let go. "We've got him," the female paramedic said gently, kneeling beside Naomi. Her name tag read Martinez. "You did good. Real good. Can you give us some room?" Naomi nodded, but her legs didn't want to work. She'd been running on adrenaline for the past 4 minutes, maybe 5, and now that the crisis had passed, her body was presenting her with the bill. Her muscles trembled, her vision swam. She tried to stand and nearly pitched forward, saved only by Colonel Avery's hand catching her elbow. "Easy," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it all afternoon. "You just saved a man's life. Take a minute." The paramedics moved around them with practiced choreography. Oxygen mask over Rourke's face, IV line started in his arm, monitor leads attached to his chest, the machine beeping reassuringly as it displayed a heart rhythm that, while not perfect, was steady and viable. They asked questions, rapid-fire and clinical. How long was he down? What interventions were performed? How many shocks from the AED? Naomi answered on autopilot. Her medical training provided the precise details they needed. Approximately 90 seconds before CPR initiated, continuous compressions for approximately 3 to 4 minutes, one shock delivered, rhythm converted to sinus with good effect. Patient regained spontaneous respirations approximately 30 seconds post-shock. Martinez looked at her with new respect. "Your medical?" "Was Navy corpsman. Discharged 6 months ago."
"Well, you haven't lost your touch," the male paramedic said as he secured the stretcher straps. "Another minute or two without intervention and we'd be looking at a very different outcome. You gave him back his life." The words should have felt triumphant, should have been the validation Naomi had been searching for since Marcus Hayes died in her arms, but instead they just felt heavy. True, but heavy. Because saving one person didn't erase failing another, didn't undo the guilt or the grief or the 6 months of hiding from anything that reminded her of who she used to be. But maybe, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, maybe it was a start. The paramedics lifted the stretcher, preparing to wheel Rourke out to the ambulance. Linda moved to follow, her hand never leaving her husband's, but she paused beside Naomi. For a moment, the two women just looked at each other. Linda's face was blotchy from crying, her makeup smeared, her hair disheveled. She looked nothing like the composed military spouse who'd arrived at the ceremony hours earlier. She looked like a woman who just watched her world almost end, and then, impossibly, been pulled back from the brink. "I don't know your name," Linda said, her voice thick with emotion. "Naomi Ellis." She reached out and pulled Naomi into an embrace, so fierce it drove the breath from her lungs. "Naomi Ellis," she repeated, her voice muffled against Naomi's shoulder. "I'm never going to forget your name. Never. You gave me my husband back. You gave my grandchildren their grandfather. You gave us more time." She pulled back, her hands gripping Naomi's shoulders, her eyes boring into Naomi's with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it, but thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Naomi's throat closed up. She couldn't speak, could only nod as fresh tears blurred her vision. Linda squeezed her shoulders once more, then turned and hurried after the stretcher as the paramedics rolled it toward the exit. The gymnasium doors swung open, admitting a blast of cool evening air and the flashing lights of the ambulance parked outside. Then they closed, and the Rourkes were gone. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 people stood frozen in the gymnasium, processing what they'd just witnessed. Naomi stood alone on the stage, swaying slightly, her mind blank and buzzing at the same time. She should leave, should slip out the back exit while everyone was still stunned, get to her car, go home, lock her door, and process this alone the way she processed everything. But before she could move, Colonel Avery stepped forward. He didn't touch her, but his presence commanded attention as surely as if he'd fired a gun. The crowd turned toward the stage, toward him, toward Naomi, standing beside him, looking small and exhausted and lost. "Ladies and gentlemen," Avery said, his voice carrying across the gymnasium without need of the damaged microphone. "When Commander Rourke collapsed, I called for help. I asked if anyone was a doctor, a nurse, a medic, and in that moment of crisis, when panic threatened to overwhelm us all, one person had the courage to step forward." Naomi's face burned. This was exactly what she didn't want: attention, recognition, the spotlight she'd spent 6 months avoiding. But Avery's hand on her shoulder kept her rooted in place, gentle but firm. "Petty Officer Naomi Ellis," and Naomi's eyes widened. He'd never told him her rank. He must have asked someone, must have dug up her service record in the few minutes of chaos. 6 years of service as a Navy corpsman, multiple deployments. And today, when it mattered most, she put her training and her courage on display for all of us to see. He turned to look at her directly, his expression solemn. "You saved that man's life, Petty Officer. Not might have, not possibly. You saved him. And every single person in this room owes you a debt of gratitude." The applause started slowly,
One person clapping, then another, then a dozen, then the entire gymnasium erupting in sound. Veterans stood, their families stood, strangers stood and applauded this woman they didn't know who'd done what needed doing when no one else would. Some of them were crying, some of them were shouting, all of them were thanking her in the only way they knew how. Naomi stood there, trembling, overwhelmed, and for the first time in 6 months, she let herself feel it. The validation, the recognition, the knowledge that her skills, her training, her presence had mattered, that she'd made a difference, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the failure her trauma had convinced her she was. She didn't feel like a hero, didn't feel transformed or redeemed or whole. She still carried Marcus Hayes in her heart, still bore the weight of his death like stones in her pockets. But standing there on that stage, with 200 people applauding her courage, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she belonged. 3 hours later, Naomi sat on a bench outside the community center, her cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders against the evening chill. The sun had set while she'd been inside, darkness swallowing the small-town street until only the street lights remained to push back the shadows. She'd slipped out during the chaos after Rourke's departure, needing air, needing space, needing to be alone with the storm of emotions raging inside her chest. Her hands still shook when she looked at them. Delayed reaction, she knew. The adrenaline crash that came after every crisis, the body's way of processing the stress it had been too busy to acknowledge in the moment. She'd washed Rourke's sweat from her palms in the bathroom.
Sink had splashed cold water on her face, had stared at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. That woman had saved a life today, had stepped onto a stage in front of 200 people and done the thing she'd been most afraid of doing, had put her hands on someone's chest and fought death to a standstill and won. And she still felt like an imposter. The door behind her opened, spilling light and the murmur of voices into the quiet street. Naomi didn't turn around, hoping whoever it was would leave her alone. She wasn't ready to go back inside yet, wasn't ready to face more gratitude or questions or attention. "Mind if we join you?" Colonel Avery's voice was gentle, asking permission rather than assuming compliance. Naomi looked up to find him standing there with Linda Rourke beside him. Linda looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed but calm, her posture less frantic than it had been on the stage. She'd changed clothes at some point, traded her dress for jeans and a sweater, as if preparing for a long vigil at the hospital. "How is he?" Naomi asked, the question automatic. Linda's smile was tired but genuine. "Stable. They're running tests, but the doctors said his prognosis is good. Better than good, actually. They said if he'd gone much longer without CPR, we'd be having a very different conversation." She sat down on the bench beside Naomi without waiting for permission, and Avery took up position on Naomi's other side. Flanked, Naomi thought, though not unpleasantly. "They told me he was minutes away from irreversible brain damage. Minutes. And you gave him those minutes back." Naomi looked down at her hands. "I'm glad he's okay. I really am, but I'm not comfortable with all the attention. I just did what I was trained to do." "That's what makes you a hero," Avery said quietly. "Heroes never think they are. They just do what needs doing and then wonder why everyone's making a fuss." "I'm not a hero," Naomi said, the words sharp. "Heroes don't freeze up. Heroes don't hesitate while someone's dying. I almost didn't go up there. I almost let him die because I was too afraid to try." "But you didn't," Linda said, her hand finding Naomi's and squeezing. "You did try. That's the part that matters. Not the fear, not the hesitation, the choice you made despite them." The words struck something deep in Naomi's chest, resonating with a truth she wasn't quite ready to accept. She'd spent 6 months believing that courage meant not being afraid, that real heroes, real warriors, didn't tremble or doubt or freeze. But maybe that wasn't right. Maybe courage wasn't the absence of fear,
but the decision to act anyway, to step forward even when every instinct screamed to stay hidden and safe. There are people inside who want to see you. The ceremony's technically still going on, though I don't think anyone's really focused on the program anymore. They keep asking about you, asking where you went. They want to thank you properly. Naomi shook her head. I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't go back in there. I'm not good with crowds, with attention. I just want to go home. I understand, Linda said, though her eyes held disappointment. But before you go, I need to give you something. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet box, the kind that held jewelry or medals or precious things. She held it out to Naomi with both hands, ceremonial and deliberate. Jack wanted you to have this. I called him from the ambulance, and even though he was barely conscious, he made me promise I'd find you and give it to you. Naomi took the box with trembling fingers. It weighed almost nothing but felt heavy with significance. She opened it slowly, and her breath caught. Inside, nestled in white satin, was a gold pin, the Navy SEAL trident, eagle clutching a pistol, anchor, and trident, the iconic Budweiser that represented the most elite warriors in the Navy. It gleamed under the streetlight, beautiful and terrible and impossible. I can't take this, Naomi whispered, trying to hand it back. This is his. He earned this. I'm just a corpsman. I'm not what? Linda interrupted, her voice fierce. Not brave? Not worthy? Not a warrior? She pushed the box back toward Naomi. You kept my husband's heart beating with your bare hands while 200 people watched. You fought for his life when no one else could. You are exactly what a warrior is, Naomi Ellis. You just fight differently than he does. Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks, hot and unbidden. She looked at the trident, at the symbol of courage and sacrifice and brotherhood, and something inside her cracked open wider. This wasn't about comparing herself to SEALs or Rangers or any other combat veteran. Wasn't about measuring her service against someone else's and finding herself lacking. It was about accepting that her contribution mattered, that saving lives was just as vital as taking them, that healing was its own form of warfare fought on a different battlefield, but no less important. He wants you to know, Linda continued softly, that medics like you are the reason men like him make it home, that every SEAL who's ever been pulled off a battlefield owes their life to a corpsman who refused to quit. And he says to tell you that fear doesn't make you weak, it makes you human, and choosing to act despite that fear makes you family. Family. The word broke something loose in Naomi's chest, and she clutched the box to her heart as sobs racked her body. All the grief and guilt and fear she'd been carrying for 6 months came pouring out, ugly and raw and real, and Linda Rourke held her through it, this stranger who'd become something more in the span of 3 desperate minutes.
When Naomi could finally breathe again, Avery spoke. The veterans inside want to honor you, petty officer. They want to show you that you're not invisible, that you're not forgotten, that your service matters. You don't have to accept a medal or give a speech or do anything that makes you uncomfortable. But I'm asking you to come back inside, just for a few minutes. Let them say thank you. Let them remind you that you're part of something bigger than your fear. Naomi wiped her eyes with shaking hands. Every instinct told her to run, to hide, to protect herself from more attention and more emotion. But she thought about Commander Rourke, fighting for consciousness in the back of an ambulance. Thought about Linda, who'd almost lost everything. Thought about Marcus Hayes, who died telling her to be brave. Maybe being brave didn't mean never being afraid. Maybe it meant doing the hard thing anyway, even when it terrified you. Okay, Naomi whispered. Okay, I'll come back inside. Linda and Avery helped her stand, flanking her like honor guards as they walked toward the door. Naomi's legs felt like water, and her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept moving. One step, then another, then another. When they opened the door, the gymnasium fell silent. Every face turned toward her, veterans and families and strangers, all looking at this small woman in the sweat-stained cardigan who'd saved one of their own. And then, as one, they rose to their feet. The applause started again, but different this time. Slower, more deliberate. The kind of applause reserved for moments that mattered, for people who'd earned respect through action rather than words. Naomi walked down the center aisle, her eyes blurring with tears, the seal trident clutched in her hand like a talisman. Veterans reached out to touch her shoulder as she passed, to shake her hand, to nod with the understanding that only those who'd served could share. No words needed, just recognition, just respect, just the acknowledgement that she was one of them. When she reached the front, Avery guided her onto the stage once more. He took the microphone, and his voice carried across the silent room. I said earlier that medals are earned in many ways, not just in combat, not just under fire. Sometimes they're earned in moments like today, when someone decides that another person's life is worth more than their own fear. He looked at Naomi, his eyes bright with emotion. Petty Officer Ellis, on behalf of every veteran in this room and every service member you've ever treated, thank you for your service. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for reminding us what it truly means to be a hero. The applause thundered through the gymnasium, and this time Naomi let herself stand in it, let herself accept it, let herself believe just a little that maybe she did belong after all. That night, long after the ceremony ended and the gymnasium emptied and the veterans returned to their homes, Naomi sat in her apartment with all the lights off except the small lamp on her side table. She'd driven home in a daze, her mind simultaneously empty and overfull, her body exhausted but her thoughts racing too fast for sleep. Now she sat curled in her worn armchair, the sealed trident resting in her palm, turning it over and over, as if the movement might help her process everything that had happened. The pen was heavier than it looked, or maybe that was just the weight of what it represented. Commander Rourke had carried this for decades, had earned it through trials she couldn't imagine, had worn it as a symbol of his identity and his brotherhood. And now he'd given it to her, not as a gift to be displayed on his shelf, but as a message, a reminder, a promise. You belong. You matter. You're family. Naomi's apartment was small and sparse, decorated with the transient emptiness of someone who hadn't quite committed to staying. She'd moved here 6 months ago after her discharge, picked the first place that was clean and affordable, and hadn't bothered making it feel like home. No pictures on the walls, no personal touches, nothing that would make leaving difficult if she decided she couldn't handle civilian life and needed to run somewhere else. But tonight, looking at the trident in her hand, she wondered if running was really what she'd been doing, or if she'd been hiding from the memories, hiding from the guilt, hiding from the possibility that she might try again and fail again and have to live with another death on her conscience. Marcus Hayes's face floated into her mind, unbidden but not unwelcome. For once, she didn't push the memory away, didn't try to bury it under distractions or therapy techniques or sheer force of will. She let herself remember him, 23 years old with his whole life ahead of him, scared but trying to be brave, bleeding out on a floor in Afghanistan while she fought to save him and failed. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, to the ghost that lived in her head. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." But even as she said it, she knew something had shifted. The guilt was still there, probably always would be, but it felt different now. Less like a weight crushing her chest and more like a scar, permanent but healed.
a mark that showed she'd been wounded but survived. She hadn't saved Marcus. That truth was immutable and awful, and not her fault, no matter how much her trauma tried to convince her otherwise. The wound was too severe, the situation too dire. Sometimes people died despite the best efforts of the best medics, and that was just the cruel mathematics of medicine and war. But she had saved Jack Rourke, had kept him alive long enough for the professionals to take over, had given him and Linda and their grandchildren more time together. That was also truth, also immutable, also a mark on her soul, but this one bright instead of dark. Maybe, Naomi thought, that's what healing looked like. Not erasing the failures or pretending they didn't hurt, but balancing them with successes. Acknowledging that she'd lost battles, but refusing to allow those losses to define her entire war.
She thought about the moment on stage when she'd almost turned back, when fear had nearly won, when every instinct screamed at her to stay invisible and safe and small. She could have obeyed those instincts, could have let someone else step forward, let someone else take the risk, let someone else potentially fail. But she hadn't. She'd chosen courage over comfort, action over paralysis, the terrifying possibility of failure over the certainty of regret. And that choice, more than any medal or any applause or any recognition, was what made her a warrior. Naomi stood and walked to her window, looking out at the quiet street below. A few cars passed, headlights cutting through the darkness. Somewhere out there, Jack Rourke was lying in a hospital bed, breathing on his own, his heart beating steadily. Linda was probably beside him, holding his hand, counting their blessings. And tomorrow, they'd wake up to another day they might not have had if Naomi had let her fear win. She pressed the trident against her chest, feeling its edges dig into her palm. Tomorrow she'd find a proper place for it, maybe a shadow box on her wall, maybe pinned to a shirt she could wear on days when she needed reminding. But for now she just held it, let its weight ground her, let it be the physical manifestation of a truth she was finally starting to believe. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was the quiet choice to step forward when no one else would, to raise your hand when help was needed, to put someone else's life above your own terror and trust that your training, your instincts, your stubborn refusal to quit would be enough. Sometimes it wouldn't be. Sometimes you'd do everything right and still lose. That was the risk, the awful, unavoidable risk of caring, of trying, of being the person who stepped into the gap between life and death and fought with everything you had. But sometimes you'd win. Sometimes your hands would restart a heart. Sometimes your compressions would buy precious minutes. Sometimes you'd give someone their husband back, their grandfather back, their future back. And that possibility, that chance to make a difference, was worth every moment of fear. Naomi looked at her reflection in the dark window glass. Same face she'd seen that morning in the mirror. Same dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. Same worry lines creased into her forehead. But something was different. Something in her eyes, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held herself.
She looked like someone who'd faced her worst fear and survived. She looked like someone who'd saved a life. She looked like someone who might, just maybe, be able to forgive herself for the life she couldn't save. "I'm still scared," she told her reflection quietly. "I'm still broken. I'm still carrying him with me, and I probably always will." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm also still here, still capable, still able to help when it matters. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can be. Scared and scarred and showing up anyway." The street below remained quiet, offering no answers, no validation, no applause. Just the gentle silence of a small town at night, ordinary and peaceful and unremarkable. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own fears, its own chances to either step forward or step back. But tonight Naomi Ellis stood in her window with a sealed trident in her hand and hope flickering in her chest for the first time in 6 months.
She'd spent half a year convinced she was invisible, unworthy, too broken to matter. And in 3 desperate minutes on a gymnasium stage, she'd learned she was wrong. She was seen. She was valued. She was exactly who she needed to be. And tomorrow, when the sun rose and the world demanded that she decide again whether to be brave or be safe, she thought she might be ready to choose courage. Not because she wasn't afraid anymore, but because she finally understood that fear was just part of the equation, not the whole answer. Naomi turned from the window and walked toward her bedroom, the trident still clutched in her hand. She didn't feel transformed, didn't feel healed or whole or free of the weight she carried, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like a warrior, not the kind who sought glory or headlines or recognition, but the kind who showed up when called, who stepped forward when needed, who fought for other people's lives with the same fierce determination she'd once fought for their country. The quiet kind of hero, the invisible kind, the kind who never thought they were brave until the moment demanded it, and then discovered they'd been brave all along. Naomi Ellis set the trident on her nightstand, climbed into bed, and closed her eyes. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't dream of Marcus Hayes dying. She dreamed of Jack Rourke breathing, of Linda Rourke's grateful tears, of 200 veterans rising to their feet in recognition and respect, of her own hands, steady and sure, bringing someone back from the edge of death. She dreamed of courage, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Not the spotlight moment, but the quiet decision made in shadows. She dreamed of beginning again, of second chances, of becoming the person she'd been too afraid to believe she could be. And when morning came, Naomi woke with the seal trident catching the first light of dawn, and she smiled. Her new life was just beginning.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.